of Jezreel. Well, it's worth keeping that passage open. We'll be looking at that this evening. What is the gospel? Well, many years ago now, when I was in junior school, many years ago, we had I would describe as a typical headmaster. He was kind of very tall, very upright, always wore, well, in my memory anyway, always wore a brown suit, shirt and tie, shiny shoes, kind of was arms down by the side, very upright standing, slicked back hair, kind of scary looking, looked like some kind of sergeant major type. And there are two particular instances that I can remember from school. The first was, well, they were both school assemblies. The first was, I don't know what had happened, but clearly he was not happy with us, that we weren't listening in school assembly, I guess. In school assembly, I'm sure it was the same in your day, we used to sit on that hard kind of floor, almost like a squash court floor. Remember those hard floors? And we used to sit on the floor for assembly, for the story and whatever else we did in assembly that we can't remember now. But we used to sit there. But for whatever reason, our headmaster decided from now on, every assembly now, from now on, you're going to stand for the whole of assembly. I can remember that lasting for just one assembly. I think I was either in J3 or J4, year 5 or 6, and we were standing for assembly, and then crash, Spot, whose name I think was Jonathan, but he was Spot because he had freckles. We weren't very sophisticated in those days, and Spot suddenly had fainted. We'd been standing for however long, and his blood pressure obviously dropped, and down he went, and he fainted, and that was the last of the experiments of standing for assembly. The other thing that I can remember about this headmaster was this, that one day, one of the boys a year older than me, quite a notorious family of boys, 3 of them, hard. One of them in particular, the youngest, loved fighting. For some reason, always used to take his shirt off to fight. Don't know why, but he always did. And I can remember this kind of naughty boy, we'll call him John. Sorry, John, but we'll call him John because that was what his name was. And John was suddenly brought in front of assembly. Now, John had been caned or slippered, whatever they used to use in those days. I can't remember if it was a cane or a slipper. But there used to be corporal punishment, because I'm that old. And he'd been kind of hit by the headmaster, I think, several times. But this time, he was disciplined in assembly, in front of all the school. And I think it was a slipper, kind of bend over, touch your toes, and get 10 kind of whacks across the backside. And I can remember him, and I'd never seen this kind of hard boy before. He was very upset, and he was crying his eyes out. I remember thinking, well, I thought he was hard, and, I didn't think that would hurt. Of course, you look back and you think, it's the shame, isn't it, of being called out in front of the whole school. All because of the headmaster. What was he like? Stern, clearly in charge. Even John, hard John, would cry in front of this headmaster. He had high standards for the school. And if you didn't meet those standards, clearly you got battered or slippered or caned into submission. That's what he was like. Until, probably about 10 years or so ago, I was visiting someone in hospital, and who was in the bed next to the person I was visiting but my old headmaster? And so I got talking to him. You won't remember me, but I went to school. I was talking to him, and lo and behold, what a lovely man. A really nice guy. Not the stern, scary man that I thought he really was. I had him all wrong. What a lovely guy. Different to what I thought. And talking to him about it, of course, well, his job meant that when unruly children got really unruly, His job was to bring them back into line by whatever means were allowed in those days, in the 1970s. There you go. You may be a Christian tonight. You may have a wrong view of what God is like. Christians often get the view that God is like some stern, strict headmaster, that we take one step out of line and there God is, kind of with the stick or with the slipper, ready to batter us into submission. And that's how your friends often, and your work colleagues, and perhaps your families, often think of what God is like. And we slip into that, I think, so easily. And no wonder the world thinks in that way. No wonder your friends think that that is what God is like, if so often we think that's what God is like. We need to get the message out there that that's not what God is like. That when we look at the Bible, we don't see a story of, the Old Testament being full of wars and bloodshed, and then we've got kind of Jesus coming, and he's gentle Jesus, meek and mild, and there's two kind of different gods and all that kind of thing, that it's a violent book. But that's not what the gospel is. What is the gospel? What is the story of the Bible? We need to encourage each other as we tell our friends about the Lord Jesus, as we tell our friends about the living God. We need to tell them what God is really like. What's he like? They will think, your friends, and perhaps you're watching online, perhaps you're here this evening, and you tend to think God is like that strict headmaster, scary, battering you into submission. What is the gospel? It's the greatest, most pure love story that there ever has been and ever will be. The story of the Bible is the greatest ever love story. Problem in our world is we get saturated with inferior love stories, don't we? We kind of become numb to the story of love. Perhaps we read or we watch something, and often we don't even realize actually that it's a love story. We become so numb to these things. For the children, one of my favorite films is the film WALL-E. WALL-E is a great film. You've got this little robot, he's on his own. His job is to travel around Earth, basically recycling and getting rid of all the junk and trying to kind of clear the air, because the world is no longer inhabitable because of the junk that we've kind of produced. And WALL-E's job on his own, as he kind of dances to Tommy Steele songs and sings and goes along, that's and you think, well, that's a great environmental film. But actually, the film is a wonderful film because it's a love story between two robots. That's what it really is. But you kind of often miss that because, well, we've got to tidy up the planet and all that kind of thing, which is a justification, but it's really a love story. Or we watch something like Only Fools and Horses and we think, well, it's a comedy and it's this and that. But actually, it's a love story, isn't it? Between an older brother and the sibling that he's looking after and loves. And he puts first. We get saturated with inferior love stories. Here's the greatest love story ever, the gospel. What is the gospel? It's a love story. The Bible starts with the marriage of Adam and Eve. And the story of the Bible in Revelation finishes with the marriage of Jesus with his people, the marriage supper of the Lamb. And in between those two weddings, we get the constant refrain, the constant theme of God's love for you and for me, God's love for his people. The story of the Bible, the gospel, is not the story of God battering you into submission. The story of the Bible is God wanting your heart and going for your heart with his great love for us. Problem is, of course, that sin is in the world. And the problem of sin is not just all around us, it's within us as well, isn't it? And the problem of sin is, instead of willingly receiving the love that God offers us, Instead, we set our affections on inferior things, on inferior love stories. We set our affections on things that grab hold of our hearts and harm us. You see that throughout the story of the Bible. Here's God's love for his people. We're going to see it tonight as we look at Hosea in a moment. But straight away, God rescues his people from Egypt, the Exodus. It's a wonderful story of salvation, isn't it? God is showing his love. He's proving his love with all the miracles and the parting of the Red Sea and them going. And what happens? As God is basically showing them how he wants them to live, what's best for them, what do? They get scared and start making a golden calf to worship instead. Something inferior. So, you can't even compare a golden calf to the living God. And then they're traveling through the wilderness. What do? They complain about the food that God lovingly provides for them. So yes, we see God disciplining his people. But loving parents discipline their children, don't they? Because they love them. You don't discipline other people's children unless you're the headmaster, of course. But we don't, do we? We discipline those that we love. Our issue, our problem of sin means that we reject the love that God has so graciously, so wonderfully given to us, and we go after other things instead, inferior love stories. So let's have a look very briefly this evening at the book of Hosea, and in particular chapter 1 really, and then we're going to have a look at chapter 3 as well. But Hosea is a prophet of God. In verse 1 we're told exactly when he is profiting, when he is called to be a prophet, when he lives. He's during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So there's 4 of those kings of Judah, and there's 1 king, Jeroboam, in Israel. So we've had the civil war. We've got the 10 tribes and the 2. We've got Israel separated from Judah. There they are. And into that historic setting comes this prophet Hosea. And God calls him to do a very unusual thing. He's given a clear task to do. It's not just to speak, it's to live. It's to do something. What is it? Well, he's told, go and marry someone. Well, that's great, you say. Hang on. Go and marry a promiscuous woman. Go and marry someone that you know is very, very, very likely to be unfaithful. That's who you've got to marry. Go and marry her. And in carrying out the task, Hosea is going to know what it's like for God. God, in his dealings with Israel, is a faithful husband who's got a promiscuous wife. A wife who's just going after other lovers. An Israel who is going after other things. A Judah who is unfaithful as well. His people are leaving him. Well, Hosea, God says to him, enter in. You're going to know what it's like to be like me. You're going to know what it's like to have an unfaithful wife. Because that's what it's like for the living God, dealing with his children Israel and Judah. So that's what he does. He goes and he finds Gomer. He marries her, and she conceives and bores him a son. See, this is what it's like, God's dealings with Israel, but that's what his dealings with you and me are like as well, aren't they? Oh, we're faithful on a Sunday, but then Monday morning comes around. Oh, we're okay on a Monday, but then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, as the week goes on. Imagine being a friend of Hosea. What are you doing, Hosea? You're going to marry her. Have you heard her reputation? Don't you know what she's really like? I mean, everyone knows Gomer. Everyone knows what she's like. Really? What are you doing, Hosea? Well, God has told me. Are you sure that's what God has told you? Do you not know what's going to happen? You can't trust her. What's she going to be like as a wife? But Hosea listens to God. Hosea is faithful to God, and he marries her despite what she's like. And of course, she is fruitful as well. She produces these children that we read of. Again, imagine being a friend of Hosea. Is that really your child, Hosea? Questions would be asked. Doubt will be put into the minds of Hosea. Why? Well, because of what Gomer is like, what her track record is like, and as we'll see, what her future record is going to be like as well. Because she produces 3 children. But then off she goes again. Imagine the friends of Hosea now. Told you so. Said she'd be like that, didn't we? We told you you couldn't trust her. Well, that's what Hosea is called to do. And off she goes. She leaves him. If you've got a Bible open, turn to chapter 3, and we'll read a couple of verses from Hosea chapter 3. The Lord said to me, that's Hosea, go, show love to your wife again, though she is loved by another man and is an adulteress. Love her as the Lord loves the Israelites, though they turn to other gods and love the sacred raisin cakes. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and about a homer and a LFEC of barley. Then I told her, you are to live with me for many days. You must not be a prostitute or be intimate with any man, and I'll behave the same way towards you. For the Israelites will live for many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. Afterwards the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessings in the last days. So what's going on here? Clearly, Gomer is gone. She's left Hosea. Go and get her. Where is she? Well, she's living as a prostitute. She's with another man. You see that because he goes and pays the going rate. He pays the rate to set a prostitute free, and off he goes, and he pays the price to set her free. She's been enslaved in that job. Whether she has a choice in that matter or not, we're not told. It doesn't matter really. The point is this: she's enslaved in that sin, in that lifestyle. Whether she's enslaved by other people or money or sex or whatever it is, she's a slave. She needs to be set free. And Hosea goes and pays the price to set her free. She is so unfaithful, isn't she? It's an unusual love story, though, isn't it? What is the gospel? It's a love story. The book of Hosea is a very unusual love story. It's not boy meets girl and happily ever after, is it? It's really not. It's man meets prostitute and marries her, and off she goes and he buys her back. And it's one-sided love as well, isn't it? It's all about Hosea going to Gomer. Hosea, go and get Gomer. Hosea, go and pay the price for Gomer. And that's the point of the story. That's why God tells Hosea to do all this, because it is a picture of God's relationship with his children. It's a picture of God's relationship with Israel and Judah, but it's a picture of God's relationship with you and me as well. We're like the children of Israel. We're like Gomer in the book of Hosea. The way that Gomer treats her husband is the way that we treat God. And God could choose to stamp all over us. God could choose to force us into submission. God could use the cane and the rod or the slipper and force us to do his will, but that's not what he does. This is a love story. God wants faithfulness because it's a marriage. Not just at the beginning, but constantly in our lives. See, the children of Israel, they go after other gods, but they keep doing it. I've been reading recently in Kings and Chronicles. You just read time after time, a new king comes, and he did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. And then you see them after this god and that god. It's the Baals or the Asheroths or whatever it is. They're chasing other gods constantly. And then there's a good king and Israel comes back. And then there's an evil. And it's constant, isn't it? Back and forth. We love you, God. We are unfaithful. We love you. We're unfaithful. But aren't we the same? We go after other gods too. We're a bit more subtle, perhaps. Whether it's the god of entertainment or sex or pleasure or our health or our families or sport or happiness or the attention that others give us. We can make gods out of anything and everything. I think it was Augustine said that our hearts are idol factories. We give our hearts away to worthless things. Whilst we have a loving, kind, generous, gracious God who wants our hearts and wants to fill our hearts with his love. The God who is good, the God who always does what is right, who is the standard of what is right, and he wants you and me to have him. He wants you and me to have the best thing in the world, which is him. And he wants him to be in our hearts. And yet so easily we give our hearts away to other things. We're like Gomer, so quickly, so easily. Breaking Hosea's heart, breaking God's heart towards us. But of course God gives us the very best, doesn't he? God gives us his beloved son. Hosea goes and buys Gomer back. She's unfaithful at the beginning. She's already been promiscuous. He marries her knowing what she's like, knowing what she's going to be like, and then he has to bail her out again. Isn't that what we're like? God saves us despite what we're like, knowing what we're going to continue to be like. But that's his love. That's his grace. That's his mercy towards us. And God gives us the very best. The gospel is a love story. That's what the gospel is. It's a love story. The Son, God loves his Son, but is willing to give him for us. The Son loves the Father and is willing to come into the world because of his love for his Father. The Father loves us so intently that he gives us his Son. The Son loves us so intently he's willing to come. And the Son comes to show us what God is really like. When we look at the life of the Lord Jesus, we don't see the stern headmaster with the stick, do we? We see a loving, kind, generous, gracious man who, with a woman caught in adultery, what does he say? You, without sin, cast the first stone. And says to her to stop sinning. Why? Because he is doing what is best for her. He's showing love and compassion. And he's saying to her what is best for her. Look at the love that Jesus shows in story after story, incident after incident, encounter after encounter. Jesus shows love. Why? Well, what does the song say? Love changes everything. More accurately, we could say God's love. God's love changes everything. Where do we see it? Where do we see the epicenter of God's love? Where do we see the epicenter of Jesus' love? Is as he goes to the cross. He goes to the cross and dies, not only living for us, but he dies for us as well. Why? Out of love. That's what drives him to the cross. It's love for you and for me. As we go after other gods, God the Son comes into the world knowing that you and I will sin and reject him, but he comes in knowing that and willingly goes to the cross. We go astray, he never does. He shows his heart for us. He shows his love for us. How much? By going to the cross. By paying the price to set us free from our enslavement to sin. Just as Hosea goes and pays the right price, Jesus goes to the cross and pays the right price to set you free from sin, to set you free from that enslavement that we have to sin. He pays the going rate and sets you free. Enslaved tonight? What have you given your heart to in the past week? We give our hearts to so many things. What is the gospel? It's a love story. It's the story of Jesus coming into the world for you and for me. That's the message we've got to get across. That a God who loves us so much, he willingly gives his beloved Son for you and for me, knowing that the end of the story will be the cross and then the resurrection. If you're in any doubt, how much does God love you? Reread the Song of Songs. What a book that is. The lover and the loved. It's a book all about God's love. He's the lover, and the beloved is us in the book. God just demonstrating, showing, screaming out his love. Why? Because he wants your heart. He could batter you into submission, but that's not a loving God. He wants your heart. He wants the very best for you. He wants you part of that greatest love story that there ever is. He wants you to be captivated with him because he has shown that he is captivated with you. And he shows it in Jesus and the cross. And that's the gospel. That's why it's such good news. And the God that we call Father is not a stern headmaster. Yeah, he disciplines his children, of course. That's what loving parents do. But it's a love story where he shows his love. Oh, it's so one-sided. And it's so unusual in many days because we're so used to inferior love stories. But it's the greatest love story ever because it's the greatest love ever. Greater love hath no one than this, lay down one's life for his friends. That's what Jesus does. How deep is the love of Jesus? It's vast, it's unmeasured, it's boundless, and it's free as well. Well, we're going to sing that great song to remind ourselves of that deep, deep love of Jesus. So let's stand and sing of that love to close our service this evening.